Welcome to the Lawyering Peace Interviews series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. In each episode, we engage with diplomats, lawyers, policymakers, and peace builders who have played key roles in shaping responses to conflict and advancing pathways toward a durable peace. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. And today I am delighted to be joined by Oksana Tsymbrivska to the podcast. Oksana, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Paul. It's my pleasure to be here today with you, and thank you for this invitation. I'm very much looking forward for our conversation and exchanges.
I'm so excited that you agreed to be on our podcast, Oksana, because everyone is talking about European Union integration, Ukraine's path towards the European Union, and how it plays such a crucial role in the peace process and the conversations. So let me tell our audience a little bit about you before we kick into the questions. Oksana serves as the team leader of the European Union's flagship rule of law project, Pravo Justice in Ukraine, a program that has played a central role in supporting judicial reform, legal harmonization, and Ukraine's broader efforts towards European integration. Now, over the course of her career, Oksana has worked at the intersection of governance reform, European legal standards, and institutional resilience during one of the most consequential periods in modern Ukrainian history. Our conversation today comes at a remarkable and historic moment. While Ukraine continues to defend itself and Europe against Russia's full-scale invasion, its war of aggression, it is simultaneously undertaking one of the most ambitious political and legal transformation projects in Ukraine, preparing for membership in the European Union. Now, this effort is not simply about economics or trade, like most of us tend to think it is. It touches nearly every dimension of governance, judicial independence, anti-corruption reforms, democratic accountability, human rights protections, and of course, the rule of law. Now, today we'll explore what EU integration actually requires in practice and how Russia's war of aggression against Europe and Ukraine has shaped Ukraine's reform trajectory, and whether accession can itself actually be part of the pathway towards building a durable peace. Oksana, again, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you, Paul. I think it's indeed very important to speak about Ukraine because it's a unique candidate country for the moment, which cannot be compared with any other one. So I'm looking forward to have exchanges on this point.
Oksana, before we dive into the intellectual heft of unpacking what's required to join the EU, what's Ukraine doing in order to meet those requirements, let's hear your origin story. When did you decide that you were interested in rule of law? I noticed you've studied abroad. When did you decide you wanted to spend some time studying abroad? And what put you on this path to law, rule of law, European integration? Was this a childhood dream or serendipity?
It was never a dream, but my interest with the European integration and rule of law in general began with the university years. Obviously, I took my first master in Ivan Franko Lviv University, and then I had and finished the master degree on European Union and international law at the Amsterdam Law School. And I think this was the decisive point for me when I really understand what European law is about. And for me, what struck me the most that European Union is not about just the collection of norms. It's first and foremost about the values. So I think for me, this was one of the most important points, which I really shared on my personal levels. Values of freedom, dignity, rule of law, justice, protection of human rights. For me, that was very important. And what was important that these are not just some principles or norms written in the articles of the treaties or preambles, they are and can be legally enforceable. which was quite a different story, I would say, back then in Ukraine. And I always had this feeling, why in EU, why in Netherlands, the things are in this way, and in Ukraine, they are in different way. I was practicing law in Ukraine as a lawyer, and I felt on practice how the legal norms are functioning. And I have experienced different questions on this matter. Why some laws work effectively in practice and others simply are not working. And when I was asking myself this question and trying to find the answer, I always saw the reason that it not necessarily is always the problem in the legal norms. The biggest problem for me was application of the norms by the legal practitioners, their way of thinking and understanding of the norms. So for me, this was key. And I really ask myself a question, do I want to practice under this kind of conditions? Or would I like to change it and really be part of this change? And I am one kind of a person. I wanted to be the part of the change. And for me, this actually was the decisive story and factor why I decided to shift my professional direction. And I moved to technical cooperation and had experience of working in Council of Europe, Canadian Development Initiative, and ultimately with the EU-funded supported programs on the rule of law. If talking about Bravo Justice, I think here my experience is also quite unique because I joined the program as the short-term expert doing some small assignment on the project. But over the years, I shifted and moved to the expert position, deputy team leader, country manager, and now I am leading the project for more than 3 years already. I would not say that I ever dreamed about taking this kind of responsibility, but when the opportunities were coming, I took the responsibility, and I really knew that it was important for Ukraine to be assisted, first of all, and to be helped. When the invasion happened, I also think it's important to say that the war influenced not only how the Ukrainian institutions are functioning, it also influenced how technical cooperation is functioning. And on our side, we significantly understood the necessity of flexibility, adaptation, in order for us to be effective and valid for the Ukrainian institutions. And since the war, we are not talking about just legal expertise or comparative practices, examples. It's also about supporting the resilience of Ukrainian institutions. The electricity cuts, and this is something which demands other type of assistance. And we are also part of this, providing aid to our counterparts here in Ukraine. So I'm happy to be supported in this way also on my personal side. Thank you.
Oksana, I'm so glad you mentioned that it's as important how laws are implemented. Oftentimes at the law school where I teach and where you studied law, and in particular Amsterdam University, there's so much talk about or so much energy put into fine-tuning the laws, the norms, the rules. And if we just polish it a little bit or make it this, it'll all work. It's like, no, you need a pretty good law. And then you need to train people how to utilize it, empower people to use it. One of my students last semester said something which struck me when you were explaining sort of the empowerment of law. She just said, our motto should be see it, sue it, fix it. Basically, rule of law. Use law to fix. And it sounds like that's a lot of what you're not suing, but you're seeing it, you're applying the law, you're fixing it, all these different issues that Ukraine is sorting through as it moves forward. Let's dive a little bit into how we got here. Oftentimes people will think, oh, Russia's war of aggression against Europe and Ukraine, 2022, and then all of a sudden there's an interest in EU membership. No, the EU membership question has a long history. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but some would say that part of the prompting of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine was not only NATO fears, but also the European integration. It popped up didn't pop up, it was crucial to the Orange Revolution, to the Revolution of Dignity, and then now it's something that's on the forefront of everyone's minds. Can you walk us through the arc of history of Ukraine's interest in and engagement with EU membership?
You're absolutely right, Paul, that the story of Ukrainian integration didn't begin in 2022. I think it's important to highlight just few, I think, decisive moments which truly defined this journey. First and foremost, this is the revolution of dignity. You are absolutely right that when the president Yanukovych has refused to sign association agreement, which was decisive for Ukrainian future in the EU, Ukrainians didn't agree with this future and they decided to be against it. And also the revolution of dignity, it was about not just association agreement, it was about the values, which is the core for EU. And the values of dignity, freedom, this was exactly why people were standing on Maidan and they were fighting for this. The second mile, I think, happened in 2017 when association agreement fully entered into force and Ukrainians gained visa-free travel to EU. And this was very important for Ukrainian citizens because they, on their own skin, could feel what EU means in very simple and understandable terms. And I think that it was really important and was not longer a slogan or faraway story. It happened, people felt it, and they understood it. And the last, but I think one of the most important things which happened in 19 were changes to the constitution of Ukraine. Within these changes in the constitution, the EU and NATO membership were identified as strategic objectives for the Ukrainian nation. And this was no longer someone political party slogans or commitments. It was irreversible constitutional commitment of Ukrainian nation. So in this way, when we came to the candidacy application, it was not something that we just decided to start because the war started. Obviously, there was a very long history of different actions and historical event which made this possible.
Let's now temporarily move into the current phase that we're in, which is the EU process during wartime. And we'll come to some more detailed questions about how does one apply the rules. But walk us through the melding of candidate status as part of a peace building initiative. The candidate status was in June of 2022, months after Russia's war of aggression, or the kickoff of its war of aggression and full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And a couple of things. Some thought it was token and it would take years to achieve, but actually it came out pretty quickly, and Ukraine has been munching through quite quickly, meeting the benchmarks and making the legislative and other necessary reforms. But it seems to now be a political and symbolic, as well as an economic and values-based type of decision. So what caused the Europeans to change from, yep, we look at countries, if they're moving along politically, economically, rule of law, it makes sense to integrate them into the European Union. Takes forever. And to all of a sudden, whoa, we need to move Ukraine into candidate status as an element of peace building. Or has this always been part of the origin story of the EU to stop another war on the European continents? Let's have a European Union. So unpack this a little bit about whether this is economic trade, whether it is political, whether it's always been political, and what impact is it having in Ukraine?
I think it's important to highlight the fact that Ukraine submitted its application for EU membership just 5 days after the full-scale invasion began. 5 days. And I think no one here in Ukraine was expecting that, but when after 4 months, all 27 member states unanimously granted the candidate status, it has a very important signal for Ukraine. It was very specific because we understood that it was not just a political achievement. It was a signal of hope. It was a signal of support for Ukrainian nation and recognition that Europe stands with Ukraine. So back then and still now, it's really important for Ukrainians to hear this support, to feel it, and understand it. And honestly, the war reshaped, I think, EU attitudes toward Ukraine membership. No one before was thinking back then when association agreement was taking place and was signing that the full-scale invasion would happen. And Ukraine right now and over this 5 years is fighting not just its own independence, it's fighting about defending European values. It's fighting for EU security, European order, and fighting on behalf, I would say, of the whole European Union. So indeed, Ukraine's situation and its application to the EU membership is quite unique in comparison with other member states and will be like that, I would say. So it is a very strategic now and security-oriented question for the whole Europe. So I would not distinguish that integration comes separately with the security. I think Ukraine case has showed that these matters are very much interconnected and should be viewed like that.
So it has that impact on morale as well. Ukraine being part of Europe, Ukraine being part of the European values system. And you oftentimes hear that where the Ukrainians will say they're fighting not only for the territorial integrity of Europe, but also for European values, which the Russian regime at the moment is quite opposed to. Let's dive into the details a little bit, since you spend your days and your evenings thinking about working on EU integration. What does it actually mean? Most non-Europeans from around the globe are like, yeah, it's an economic bloc, it's a trade bloc, and yeah, they have some political dimensions, which leads to dysfunction and inability to make political decisions, but mostly it's about economic prosperity. But it's got to be more than just a trade bloc. Walk us through what EU membership or EU integration actually means.
Absolutely. Being a lawyer, you always need to start with the legal approximation. And this is key. As the countries are different, first and for the most important task which Ukraine needs to do on this way is to bring her own legislation in line with the standards of EU and EU acquis. Ukraine has done, I would rather say, a very big job on this way. So first, the screening has been done by Ukraine internally. European Commission has assessed it and provided the screening report. And on its basis, Ukraine has prepared the National Adaptation Plan, which is identifying what legal norms needs to be adapted with the EU acquis. So this actually national plan was adopted just in April of this year, 2026, and it identifies more than 1,600 legal acts which needs to be implemented by Ukraine. And what's important here is the timeline. I think it's something unique and very ambitious what Ukraine has set for itself as a deadline. It's the end of 2027. So I think that this is a very important factor which needs to be taken into consideration with regard to what Ukraine plans for and what its ambitions are. As a lawyer and knowing the internal kitchen, how the laws are being developed, how the whole process of developing the law, its assessment is taking place, obviously it's a very difficult task to perform, but still manageable. What I would say would be the most difficult element to do is implementation. You can, as we started in the beginning, you have the norms, but if they are not implemented on practice, That's a problem. And within the EU integration process, this is actually what EU is measuring, whether the laws are not just adopted, whether they are implemented in practice, whether the country is showing the track record of application of these norms. So that's the key. And within all this process of approximation and EU integration process, the core foundation of it is the rule of law. And I think this is obviously not an accidental point. This is the starting and ending point where rule of law matters are falling within cluster one, which opened the first one and closes the last one within the EU integration process. So here we are.
I always assign these podcasts to my students, and they're going to love to hear this one because basically the European Union is a jobs program for lawyers. Over 1,000 pieces of legislation and rules. So no, it's great that you've given us that depth of understanding of all of the detailed systemic changes that have to be made. You mentioned rule of law. Let's talk a little bit more about rule of law because it's interesting. It's something that everybody says. Lawyers, non-lawyers, politicians, economists, you need the rule of law. And then they move on, assuming lawyers always say you need political will before we can help. Everyone else says you need rule of law before we can help. But unpack for us, what do we mean by rule of law? And are there any particular challenges? Countries who go through transition from a post-Soviet, or in Yugoslavia's case, a post-socialist, and then others post-conflict, have challenges. But what does rule of law really mean in Ukraine? And what are some of the challenges? And what are you and your Ukrainian colleagues doing to overcome those challenges to rule of law and judicial reform?
I would agree saying that everyone talks about rule of law, but what it is actually about. So yes, this is a very interesting question, and we are trying actually on our side to explain it. That this is not one element or two elements, it's really a very comprehensive structure in the eyes of the European Union as well. And first and foremost, what needs to be there is independent judiciary. We need to have set and functioning anti-corruption institutions. We need to have accountable government and parliament. We need to have laws which would be applied equally to everyone in the country, disregarding his or her status. So this is really what rule of law is about, and importantly, that it is important to have it functioning in practice, not just on the paper, as I said. And I would like to concentrate on judicial independence, which I think is really on place number one within the rule of law, and one of the most important factors which needs to be ensured in Ukraine. To me, the best person who explained why it is so important was Alexander Hamilton. Back in 1788, he said that judicial independence, it's not just a privilege granted to judges, which actually many Ukrainians think, but it is the condition that makes it possible for judges to perform their duties, to do their work. And without truly independent courts and judges, all the constitutional rights, guarantees you have, it will be just nothing. And I think for me, this is the best explanation which explains why judicial independence is in the heart of EU accession process. And Ukraine, for the moment, I would give you a statistics. Last year, Ukraine for the first time took part in assessing the level of judicial independence within European network of Council of Judiciary. And the score which Ukraine received was 5.9 within 10 points. And in EU, in all other member states, the average level of judicial independence is around 8.5. Obviously, this says that Ukraine has problems, But there are also some explanations why they are here and what Ukraine is doing over the years to approach them. And the first big, and I would say the biggest challenge, is the judges shortage crisis, which happened not just like this. There were a very big historical moment that for 4 years judicial competitions were not taking place in Ukraine. And we are still tackling this problem. We took efforts to renew two key judicial governance bodies in Ukraine. This is High Council of Justice and High Qualification Commission of Judges, who were also not functioning. We supported re-election and transparent competition to this body to renew the trust. And this process takes time. So unfortunately, this big gap of 4 years when the competitions were not taking place set the outcome when no one was coming to the system, but people were leaving the system due to different conditions and reasons. And even now, when we are like on the 5th year of full-scale invasion, we still have around 54% of lacking of judges in the country in comparison with the ultimate number which needs to be in the system for it to fully to function. But in all of these conditions, I think it's very important to highlight to the whole EU and other part of the world that since the full-scale invasion, the judiciary system didn't stop for a second. And over all these 5 years, all Ukrainian citizens are receiving access to justice. And this is key. People are going to courts. They have problems. People are divorcing. There are different kind of demands where the court is important for them. And they are addressing the court with these matters, and their complaints are being reviewed by the court. So I think here, despite of all the challenges, it's important to send the message and say about the unique resilience of the justice system of Ukraine, which continues to function, as well as in parallelly to be transforming in a way and meet other EU requirements. And so that's a very unique thing, obviously.
It's been so impressive how much you've been able to accomplish, Prava Justice, and the Ukrainian judicial system. As you say, it's functioning in a time of war. Ukraine is moving along with dealing with the ability or doing what's necessary to hopefully close some of the chapters on the acquis. But it's in a time of conflict. It's in a time of war. Most of the places that we've engaged have been like, everything's on hold while we're in conflict and state of emergency. Now, I understand Ukraine is in a state of emergency, but oftentimes countries will declare a state of emergency, then stop all progress on rule of law, on human rights, on democracy. But Ukraine seems to be pedaling twice or three times as fast on judicial reform, legal reform, focusing on integration with the European. I guess a question is, why is it seen as so crucial? And what is the magic behind this, behind the ability to fend off Russia's war of aggression, to defend European values, to defend European territory, and at the same time be busily engaging in very comprehensive reform?
I think it's firstly, we need to say that there was no other choice. Either you do reforms or you just give up. And I think reforms here became a necessity to survive, necessity to defend Ukraine itself from the aggressor. And we needed very much strong institutions and their institutional resilience in order to survive. So this is really as simple as that. In order to survive, we needed to do the reforms, to need to have strong institutions which would help the country to move forward and really have even the spirit Spirit is very important in the story. So the state institutions were showing this, that the state is functioning. We are here with you, and we are here to improve ourselves. And I think all this story with the 5 days when Ukraine submitted its application to EU was a very decisive and important factor in the story, because EU accession process created a momentum and, I would say, a discipline in the reform process. It became very much structured, very understandable for Ukrainian institutions, what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, what are the timelines, and what is the priority, and what is the most important thing. So the EU integration process is obviously helping Ukraine to, in this way, it is very clear for Ukrainians. And last year, Ukraine adopted a rule of law roadmap, which is the key document of all the measures which needs to be done by Ukrainian institutions to meet the requirements on the rule of law, basically chapters 23 and 24. So it was not that someone told that you need to do it. Ukraine defined it on its own in very close negotiations with the European Commission, and there are deadlines. Everything is clear and understandable. So it's, something you think, oh, European integration is something very complex, you cannot understand it. But when at the same time, it's very structured and understandable to the state officials of Ukraine. And I think this is also one of the reasons why we are moving forward, even in time of war, because we have a structured process. EU integration.
You mentioned this briefly, but I want to expand and get your thoughts on this. The human dimension indicated that, yeah, even though we're in a time of war, the Ukrainians are still, as a people, interested in EU integration and why put it off. We'll get to some of the practical security aspects and peace building aspects. I know you're not a sociologist, but talk to me about Ukrainians. Whenever I talk to my American friends, they're like, yeah, Ukrainians, they're Europeans. I thought they were in the EU. Why aren't they in the EU? The Europeans give different answers. Some of them like, yes, of course.
Yeah.
Oh, Ukraine, that's really far away. At least the Portuguese think it's really far away, and the Spanish too nowadays. But what is I know this is not a fair question, but what do the Ukrainians, all 25 million of them, think about European values and their identity as Ukrainian Europeans? And is that deepening? Clearly, there's a distancing from any affinity for Russia or elements of the culture that are Russian. That's being distanced. But is there a magnetic attraction now to increasingly to European values, or no? Ukrainians have always been European, and this is where we belong, and we want to be part of the union. I asked you lots of little mini questions, so you can pick whichever one.
Yeah.
And just answer the one. And
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. I think core answer hides behind still the values. As I started with regard to the revolution of dignity, this is why Ukraine are continuing now to fight the aggressor after 5 years of full scale invasion, because of freedom, because of equality, because of accountability, which they want for the aggressor to hold. This is the core why Ukraine feels that it's Europe, why it wants to be within the European family. The second point, which I think it's important to say, that obviously everyone understands here in Ukraine that European integration and Europe, it's about opportunities. And obviously, economic factors are very much important. We are talking about opportunities for business, opportunities for work, opportunities for youth and studies opportunities. This is very much important, and everyone, I think, here do understand that. And I would, with regard to the trust, this is something very much important here in Ukraine, because the trust, in the end of the day, is the most important thing. The trust to the state, trust to the institutions. If you go to the court, could you be sure that you will receive the judgment which could be fair, which could be enforceable in the end of the day. So this is why Europe matters, its principle matters, and why Ukraine is continuing its resilience and at the same time transformations within the rule of law sector.
Let's pivot from the human dimension to the security dimension. Oftentimes, peace builders or those involved in thinking through transatlantic security, European security, will say Ukraine's membership in the European Union is an important cornerstone of security for Europe, of security for Ukraine. Of course, membership in NATO, Article 5, protection, or a bespoke security arrangement with the United States underpinned by a treaty would be the most obvious and most secure, basically, security guarantee. But there seems to be, I don't want to say a pivot towards, but an openingness to wait, if the European brings Ukraine in as a member, then it's covered both by Article 42, which I don't think any of the Europeans have really noticed up until the last year. And they're like, wait, we have a collective self-defense paragraph in our treaty. And so folks are trying to unpack what that means and stretch it to so that it includes an actual Article 5 type of obligatory response. But there's also the notion that who would dare attack a European Union member state, absent any formal agreement to come to their defense, just being part of the European Union family has a degree of security and therefore contributes to durable peace. Is this all just smoke and mirrors, or would Ukrainian membership in the European Union be a solid cornerstone of a durable peace and a secure Ukraine into the next century?
I'm not a security expert, so I will speak here on my personal opinion. And I do think that Ukraine security and European security are obviously very interconnected matters. And you cannot view the two things separately, because in the end of the day, we are defending Europe. And if Ukraine would fall, Europe would fall. So I do think that that would be the consequence. And if we would talk about durable peace, for me, it requires not just the security elements, but if the war would end, or if there will be any additional threats to Europe, what is really important, in my opinion, are strong institutions. And you cannot win in the war without building strong institutions. And I think here European integration is really very much important and bringing the added value for Ukraine's winning opportunities in this war, because we are trying to resist as well as to become stronger within the war, within fighting with the aggressor. So for me, I would see that it is a win-win situation, that security of Ukraine cannot be viewed without security of Europe, and Europe's security without security of Ukraine. So they are very interconnected matters and dependent on each other.
Oksana, you've been so generous with your time. I just have two more questions for you, if I may. One is, what do you see as some of the challenges on the road ahead? Obviously, there's a continuing war of aggression. Legally, Ukraine is operating under a state of emergency, so that has some constraints on what laws can be adopted. But what are one or two of the challenges that no one's thinking about? And what are the prospects for overcoming these challenges?
I will speak obviously about the rule of law sector, as this is my primarily sector of expertise where I am working for. And I can say that indeed we can say and see very big things of changes and transformations which happened over years in the judiciary as well as anti-corruption sector. But still within the rule of law domain, there are some elements of the rule of law which were untouched over the years. And here I would name the bar reform, Over 3 years in a row, European Commission was emphasizing the need for the comprehensive bar reform which would happen in Ukraine to ensure that transparency of self-governance bodies of the bar, their accountability, to ensure transparent and access to the profession of lawyers. So I think this is a very challenging reform which stands ahead of Ukraine, and it would be a real test for the parliament whether this reform would move on and would succeed, or it will be delayed. Also, I think it's important to highlight that even inside other justice sector institutions, other bodies are already talking about the necessity of this reform. Just a few days ago, High Council of Justice issued its annual reform about independence of judiciary, and they named the necessity of the bar reform, and the parliament needs to tackle this as one of the factors which needs to happen. So I think it's a very important factor that it's not just coming from the outside, that EU is placing this reform of the agenda, that even other already reformed institutions are talking about this as well. And the second point I would say would be the prosecutorial reform, and specifically the topic of a selection and dismissal of the prosecutor general. This is a very political topic, obviously. This is already one of the interim benchmarks which was provided for Ukraine to be delivered in 2026. But we understand that this topic, as well as the previous one, would require a lot of political will and agreement inside Ukraine with different branches of power, how these reforms would be delivered. I think in order Ukraine to succeed, not just on this two reform, challenging reform. There are many others which are still on the list, maybe not that everyone knows about them, but still, it's important not to, for my opinion, not to lose the courage to continue. Being on the 5th year of war obviously is difficult. Just today there was a very intense missiles on Kyiv, and you need still to wake up in the morning and go to work to provide people access to justice and to do other types of work in order to ensure for the state to function. But this courage not to give up on different matters, including the reforms, is very important.
Oksana, for the last question, I want to pick up on courage and the courage that you express every day by, as you say, getting up and going to work on what you care about, judicial reform, which is so crucial for EU integration. Our thousands of listeners cover retired senior professionals who just want to keep up on what's going on around the world, mid-career professionals who want to be in the know on peace building, on Ukraine, on some of the other conflicts that we cover, and a huge number of young professionals who are looking for role models who've done cool and amazing things. Now, whenever they ask me a question, I say, the last time I got a job was 30 years ago. What do I know about how to get a job? Or what do I know about how to be in my 20s or 30s? I have fond memories of the 80s, but mostly spending time on the beach. But Oksana, you've done such an amazing job, so to speak, of pursuing your passion related to law and the rule of law. And every day you get up and you work at Provo Justice under fire, literally and figuratively. What thoughts, ideas, inspirations do you have to share with young professionals who want to make a difference, have an impact, champion what matters, have a self-actualized life, doing important things? What did you learn in your last 15 years that you'd like to share with young professionals as they're embarking on their career?
Thank you so much for this question, Paul. If there would be something I would like to pass, I think it's not to be afraid and not to wait for ideal moment to implement your ideas. Because even in the reform dimension, there won't be any ideal moment or best opportunity or some better political environment or security environment. So just do not wait. Invest your time in the ideas you believe. Find people who will be your allies on this track. And believe me, there are so many bright people with whom you can overcome mountains. And just see how you are delivering from the idea to actual delivery. For me, actually, this is the most pleasant thing where I receive joy in my work, when seeing how an idea came to realization and I see it working on practice. I see that institutions are becoming stronger, and I'm really happy that I was privileged to be part of that. So don't be afraid.
Oksana, I'm so grateful that you used the word joy, because in the work that you do, the work that my young professional colleagues want to do, it's intense, but you can still find joy in making a difference and having an impact. So, Oksana, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing such thoughtful insights into Ukraine's extraordinary journey toward European integration during a time of war and profound national transformation. I'm so glad you allowed me to ask you not only rule of law questions, but sociology questions, military security questions. You were very accommodating of I'm a Gemini, so I kind of bounce around with many different thoughts in my head at the same time. But your reflections on rule of law, institutional resilience, and the broader meaning of Europe for Ukraine really helped to illuminate why this process matters, not only for Ukraine, but for the future stability and security of Europe as a whole. And most importantly, I think for the democratic transformation, you can't simply postpone that type of transformation until the end of a conflict. And the people of Ukraine are diligently and assertively pursuing that. So, Oksana, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul. It was my pleasure, and I really enjoyed our conversation today.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us for this episode of Lawyering Peace. We look forward to continuing these conversations on diplomacy, law, and peace building in future episodes. Until then.